And then all of a sudden, people will call you a black diamond. You know? So in other words, even that, when they look at us, they look at us as commodities. You know, we are this diamond. You know, so we must be captured somehow. And hence comes your DAs and all these other accounts and all of that. Basically to say, to consolidate a capitalist class, we must make sure that these so-called black diamonds don't look the other way, where they're coming from. That's what Dr. Gentleman was talking about. I don't think the black middle class, so-called, will ever, in their majority, forget the history. There's no myopia about it. They know where they're coming from. They may not all know where we should be going, but because they belong to a certain liberation movement that has a very clear mandate on the MDR, they will, I think, in the majority, still, until such time, those targets of the MDR have been met, and they're far from being met, as things stand. No offense about NUMSA forming their own workers' party and all of that. I wish them luck. Point is simple. So far, we're still at a stage where we cannot even begin to think that there will be fissures. Black people in the majority, in the middle class, so-called, will continue to vote ANC precisely because those targets of the NDR have not been met.
All right, thank you. Okay, Roger.
I said everybody's got an opinion about this topic. I'm going to try and answer the last two, well, probably the last three questions first, then go back to the first question. As I mentioned, the whole issue about definition, trying to work out what a black middle class is enormously complicated. And which, if I go back to that video I haven't got. It's a video I haven't got a diagram of where I've worked this out, the various levels of the class system. I think one of the problems with a lot of the literature on the black middle class is that it actually abolishes the middle. If you look at the black diamond literature, it just lumps in the black elite and the black middle class together. It doesn't separate them out at all. And I think a lot of the literature of the economists as well. Poor always seem to be with us, the middle class are always rising, and nobody seems to mention this upper class or, God forbid, an upper class, a ruling class. And I think that you're quite correct that there are significant levels and variations within the black middle class itself, as I was suggesting with my later segmentation. And these are divisions of orientation and interest, or rather different relationships to the state as well. By far the largest category is what we might term the civil petty bourgeoisie, which really relates to junior civil servants, public employees, and it goes across the, I would say, moving into the white collar occupations and so forth. And I would argue that they will certainly have different class interests from the corporate, black bourgeoisie proper, and indeed maybe the very senior state managers. So, and I'm also, if I can go back to my introduction about the orientation, where, although I argue that the broad ways in which black middle class are approached, the two traditions, Lipset versus Barrington-Moore/Ruschmeyer, I would lean far more towards the Ruschmeyer tradition, which argues that you've got to look at a particular situation to see which way a middle class is likely to blow. So broadly, although with a lot more nuance, maybe I was giving the wrong impression. In fact, maybe what I was talking about was much more in terms of political orientations, what we might call the core middle class, the upper segments of the middle class, rather than the lower segments. But let me leave that there. The political orientations, as I mentioned, I think the notion of historical attachment is enormously important. And I think this goes back really to the first question which was arising about the way in which there is a black middle class now which is increasingly becoming independent of the state. The more it is moving into the private sector, and the more opportunity it is getting. We're looking perhaps at this black business and trading bourgeoisie and so forth. The more that develops. Again, I think we need to qualify that. I think that the extent to which there has been black upward mobility in the private sector is far less hitherto than within the state sector. If we look, I know the employment equity statistics, the Commission for, employment equity, their statistics are a little bit dodgy, but we see that black upward mobility there seriously lags behind than in the public sector. Many of black entrepreneurs are, of course, themselves heavily dependent upon state relationships, whether it's at provincial or at municipal level. So the level of independence of that, what we might call black business and trading bourgeoisie or petty bourgeoisie or whatever, is still, I think, is still questionable. What I think is much more the case, and I think one can argue this perhaps more strongly, is that particularly as we move across the generations, that the dynamics I've been talking about, affirmative action and schooling in particular, the way in which the ANC in power has broadly facilitated the upward mobility of a lot of black people. Unsurprisingly, the bulk of the black middle class sees the ANC as having delivered. Without the ANC having come to power in 1994, many of the opportunities of perhaps the majority of the black middle class would have been far more constrained, obviously, than if the National Party, God forbid, was still with us. The other issue, of course, is I think so broadly, I think I'm going to go back to my argument. The closer you are to the state, the more likely it is you're going to continue supporting the ANC. So I think your argument conforms with that. If you're moving away from the state, if you're less dependent economically on the state, then maybe you're going to be more disposed to consider political alternatives. And maybe that's going to be a cross-generational thing. But on the other hand, of course, there has also got to be a proper political alternative available. And hitherto, we have not yet seen a political alternative which black middle class seems to find attractive. Certainly if we're looking at the way in which the DA has sought very much to attract the black middle class, but has only made very limited inroads. Although someone can help me out, where the DA claims that it got 760,000 black votes the last election. If anybody can help me to work out where those came from, I'd be very pleased. It's a bit of a mystery. So I think that's probably covered.
Yeah, let's get some more input from the audience. Tony.
One of the threads that runs through. One of the threads that runs through your dissertation today is that the system is much more complicated than may appear.
Much more
complicated than may appear. What I think we should do is to think in a different paradigm. We keep drawing triangles with a couple of lines across it. And I think that is very simplistic. Society is a complex continuum, and the secret of understanding society and therefore being capable of development depends, I think, on assessing as accurately as possible the dynamics operating within that society, and looking at the ebb and flow, and looking at the ideas which prompt that ebb and flow of forces within society. The longer we go on drawing the lines and thinking of classes as blocks of people, the longer we will fail to develop the population and the country and so on.
Thanks. Other questions?
Yeah. Based on your analysis, how do you explain the marginal support that the ANC had in the cities and the great support that they had in the rural areas? Thank you.
Sorry, you just repeat that.
Based on your analysis of the middle class, how do you explain the marginal support that the ANC had in the cities, the metros, especially the Eastern Cape, Johannesburg, and the high support that they get in the rural areas?
Yeah.
Just very simply, you mentioned you might explain competitive authoritarianism. If you could just elaborate on that, thanks.
Can we go for those?
Okay.
And then,
Tony, I think I sympathise with you a lot there, and I think one of the problems of this sort of paper is what some people might see as implicit suggesting that classes act in a particular uniform way. If you look at that great introduction to E.P. Thompson's book on the making of the English working class, he argues in that we can only identify classes after the event. In other words, when they've done what they want to do. And in many ways I'm very sympathetic to that, because to try to capture the political orientations of very large numbers of people is obviously, from the start, perhaps a flawed exercise in the first place. But on the other hand, we also need to do it. And I think if you're suggesting that we abolish class from our analysis, I can't go beyond that, because I think the divisions of people according to income, occupation, ownership of property, etc. remain fundamental, and they remain fundamental to our trying to discern political orientations. It doesn't necessarily mean that we may want at particular moments in time for particular class alliances or class compromises to come about. Going back to the first question about the important economic role that the black middle class is likely to have in this country in the future. ANC support in the cities. Again, I think that let me try and clearly what's happened in. I say clearly. I withdraw that word. What would appear to happen in Gauteng, particularly in the provincial vote, is that there would seem to be a drift of some supporters of the ANC away from the ANC, certainly at provincial level in Gauteng. And this seems to have been suggested before the election happened in terms of booings of Zuma and so forth. The extent to which we can regard that as a changing broad political orientation to the ANC as opposed to the orientation of the Gauteng ANC towards the Mbeki wing as opposed to the Zuma wing certainly complicates the matter. But Where that support went, I don't know, and I think this is why I think it's, for all the limitations of the DA approach, I think it's very important to try to understand where the DA got its vote from. And I think we simply don't know, and I'm trying to find that out. Competitive authoritarianism is the subject of a major book by Lefitsky and Way, sorry to be that, talking a way in which the democratic gains of the early 1990s throughout the world, across continents and in Africa, have been eroded, and that although we now have competitive elections, but that these elections are skewed, they are still fundamentally set up so that a particular party benefits and wins, that there is greater political freedoms in terms of freedom of expression, less people being put in prison for political protests, etc., but at the end of the day, dominant